unions.
Governor, you've said that the president should focus on balancing his own budget, but beyond that, do you think that his stepping into a state collective bargaining issue is inappropriate? And what do you think of his political arm, Organizing for America, taking a role in mobilizing some of the opposition?
Well, I think you're right. The president ultimately should stay focused on fixing the federal budget because they've got a huge deficit. And believe me, they got their hands full. They're far from getting it accomplished in Washington. But in a larger context, you know, the thousands of protesters who were here over this past week have every right to be heard, at least those from Wisconsin. And increasingly, as you just alluded to, there are more and more coming in from other states across the country. But for those who are here from Wisconsin, they have every right to be heard. But I pointed out there are over 300,000 state and local workers who weren't here, who are doing their job, doing what they're paid to, and we appreciate that. My hat's off to them. But most importantly, there are 5.5 million people in this state, taxpayers who, by and large, are sacrificing in their own jobs in the private sector, paying much more than the 5.8% for pension and the 12.6% for health care I'm asking for. In fact, in many cases, 2 or 3 times that amount. They've made tough sacrifices to balance the budgets in their communities, in their homes, and in their businesses. I think it is realistic that we need to make sure that as loud as the voices are in the Capitol, we don't let them overpower the voices of the taxpayers I was elected to represent and elected to get the job done, which is balancing this budget.
Well, let's talk about that. You say this is not about the unions, this is about balancing the budget, but your opposition says this is about union busting. So let's take a look at what is in your plan, because beyond making public workers pay more for benefits, here's what your plan would do. It would allow unions to negotiate only over wages, not benefits or work rules. The state would no longer collect union dues, and unions would have to win an election every year to keep representing workers. Isn't that union busting?
Yeah, no, absolutely not. Our belief is if we're going to ask more for a health care and more for a pension contribution, which is, by the way, a very realistic amount. My brother is a typical middle-class family. He's a catering manager for a hotel here in Wisconsin. His wife works for Sears. They got 2 beautiful girls. A typical Wisconsin middle-class family. He told me last week, and he reminded me, he said, Scott, hey, I'm paying almost $800 a year, or a month, excuse me, to pay for my health care and to set aside the little bit I put in terms of my 401k. He'd love, like most every other worker in the state, would love to have the deal we're putting on the table for our state and local government workers.
But Governor, I want to talk about the specific things about collective bargaining and saying that unions have to hold elections every year, and that's what your critics say is union busting, not the argument about the money issues.
But the two go hand in hand. If we're going to ask our state and local workers who are doing a great job to pay a little bit more to sacrifice to help to balance this budget, we should also give them the flexibility of saying that for those members, for those workers who don't want to be a part of that union, who don't want that deduction each month out of their paycheck, they should be able to get that $500, $600, or in some cases $1,000 back that they can apply for their health care and their pension contribution. For us, if you want to have democracy, if you want to have the American way, which is allow people to have their choice, that's exactly what we're allowing here. If people see the value, if they see the worth, they can continue to vote to certify that union, and they can continue to voluntarily have those union dues that write the check out, give it to that union to make their case, but they shouldn't be forced to be a part of this if that's not what they want to do.
This really gets...
And Chris, one other quick thing on this. The other thing that's important to remember, they talk about worker rights. Wisconsin, several generations before collective bargaining was legal here in the state of Wisconsin, we passed at the turn of the last century the strongest civil service protections in the country. There's no state that has a better civil service system in terms of protections. That does not change in this. Worker rights will be maintained even after our bill passes.
This gets to a bigger question, and that is whether or not you think there's something structural here, that the way the system has developed over the years, public employees and public employee unions have the upper hand when it comes to negotiation with state or local governments. Do you think that the public worker unions have gotten too powerful?
Absolutely. There's no doubt about it. Like I said, for 8 years, I was a local official, a county official. I saw firsthand, for me at the county level, for every school district, for every city, county, town board out there, And they've been asking for this. This didn't just come up after Republicans took the majorities last November. For decades, local government officials have been asking for these sorts of controls so they could balance their budgets. And the counter is, and I saw this at the local level, what they would try and force us to do is to say, go ahead, lay 500-600 people off. We don't care. You can't touch our benefits. In this case, if we don't do it in Wisconsin, it's 5,000 to 6,000 state government workers who'd have to be laid off. It's another 5,000 to 6,000 local government workers in a state that has a 7.5% unemployment rate, which, thank God, is better than the national level, but still too high to be acceptable in Wisconsin. I can't have anybody laid off. I don't want a single person laid off in the public nor in the private sector, and that's why this is a much better alternative than the losing jobs.
Governor, the same kind of thing, the idea of trying to make unions give up some of their collective bargaining rights, is going on in Ohio, in Indiana, in Tennessee, and a bunch of other states. Some people are saying that what's going on in your state and what you're involved in right now is a watershed. This is a Ronald Reagan and the air controllers moment. Is it a test case for the power of government versus the power of the public employee unions?
Well, I do think it has large ramifications, and I'm proud of the fact that Wisconsin, who led the way when it came to welfare reform and education reform under my friend Tommy Thompson in the 90s, potentially could be leading the way when it comes to budgetary and fiscal reform in this country. But this is not something new to me. I've spent 8 years before this as a county executive trying to do exactly the same thing. I talked about it in the campaign. I talked about it in the transition. I've talked about it since I took office. And if we're going to be in this together, and our $3.6 billion budget deficit is going to take a whole lot more than just employee contributions when it comes to pension and health care, but it's got to be a piece of the puzzle, because as I saw at the local level, it's like a virus that eats up more and more of the budget if you don't get it under control. This is about balancing not only our next budget, but the budgets 2, 4, 6 years into the future. And I think right now, frugality is in. People expect us to make tough decisions to make sure we don't pass the buck on to our kids and our grandkids, and that's exactly what we're doing here in Wisconsin.
Governor, we have less than 30 seconds left. Before we went on, you were telling me that you've been talking to some of the other governors, like John Kasich in Ohio. What are they saying to you? Hang in there?
Well, absolutely. You know, whether it's him or Chris Christie or Mitch Daniels or Tim Pawlenty or a lot of other folks around the country, they're saying, hang in there, you're doing the right thing. And amazingly, I got in one day 19,000 emails on Friday, the overwhelming majority saying, stay the course, you're doing the right thing. And it's always good when you're doing things for the right reason. That's what we're doing here in Wisconsin.
Governor Walker, thank you so much for joining us today. We very much appreciate it, and we'll stay on top of the story.
Thank you, Chris.